Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some people bounce back from tough times way better than others? Or why some bad experiences stick with us more than others? Well, this new study dives right into that. Today we'll be talking about how the kind of bad stuff that happens to us, and more importantly, how we deal with it afterwards, can seriously shape how we feel and how we cope with those tough experiences. It is a look at trauma, but with a focus on understanding the differences. Basically, the researchers wanted to understand why, when people go through something really hard, some end up with big problems later, while others don't. They specifically looked at whether the type of trauma matters, and how our personal way of coping plays into all of this. So, what kind of trauma are we talking about here? They divided it into two main groups. There is interpersonal trauma, which is when another person directly harms you, like an assault or an attack. Then there is non-interpersonal trauma, which is more like a natural disaster or a bad accident. The paper starts by saying that interpersonal trauma, unfortunately, tends to be linked to higher rates of PTSD and other distress compared to non-interpersonal types. This is where coping comes in, how we react and try to handle stress. They looked at a few ways people cope. Therese problem-focused coping, which is like trying to fix the situation directly. Then there is emotion-focused coping, which is about managing your feelings. And importantly, they focused on avoidant coping, which is pretty much avoiding the problem or the feelings associated with it. Think of avoidant coping as sticking your head in the sand or trying to distract yourself constantly. The paper suggests this kind of coping, the avoidant kind, is often not great for you in the long run, especially after trauma. So, how did they figure all this out? They ran an online study. They gathered information from 300 people who had experienced a traumatic event in the last 18 months. They asked people about the most distressing traumatic event they'd been through recently, and classified it as either interpersonal or non-interpersonal. Then they used questionnaires to measure their current levels of PTSD symptoms, depression, anxiety, stress, and life satisfaction. They also asked about the coping strategies they used after the trauma. Now, for the interesting part, what did they find? This was found across the board, whether the trauma was interpersonal or not. The more people used avoidant coping strategies, like denial or self-distraction, the more they tended to report higher levels of PTSD symptoms, depression, anxiety, and stress. Basically, avoiding the pain often leads to more pain later. This is a big one. When they compared people who had experienced interpersonal trauma to those who had experienced non-interpersonal trauma, they found some key differences. The interpersonal trauma group reported significantly higher levels of PTSD symptoms, depression, anxiety, and stress. They also reported lower life satisfaction. And interestingly, they used avoidant coping strategies more often. This supports the idea that interpersonal trauma can have a more severe and lasting impact. The study also looked at how much each factor contributed. They found that avoidant coping was a really strong predictor of PTSD symptoms, regardless of the trauma type. And even after accounting for coping, the type of trauma itself still played a role in predicting those symptoms. This is where it gets really interesting. They explored whether avoidant coping acts as a bridge between the type of trauma and the resulting symptoms. And the results suggest it does. It looks like avoidant coping partially explains why interpersonal trauma might lead to more severe PTSD symptoms. So, the fact that people who experience interpersonal trauma are more likely to use avoidant coping is a significant part of why they might experience more distress. So, what does this all mean for us? Well, it strongly suggests that how we cope, especially if we tend to avoid things, is a crucial factor in how well we recover from trauma. For people who have gone through interpersonal trauma, this avoidant coping might be a particularly dangerous trap. This research highlights that focusing on helping people develop healthier coping strategies, especially moving away from avoidance, could be a really important part of therapy and prevention efforts. If we can help people face their experiences and manage their feelings in more adaptive ways, we might be able to lessen the long-term impact of trauma. Think about it. If someone has gone through a profoundly violating experience like an interpersonal trauma, it makes sense that they might want to push it all away. But this study implies that while understandable, that avoidance can actually make things worse over time by not allowing for processing and healing. The good news is that treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy for PTSD have already shown that they can help people reduce these avoidant coping patterns. This research just adds more weight to the importance of those therapeutic targets. The researchers also touched on why interpersonal trauma might push people towards avoidance more. They suggest it could be linked to deeper changes in how people think about themselves and the world after such violating experiences. If your core beliefs about safety or trust are shattered, avoiding those thoughts and feelings might seem like the only option. Now, like all research, this study has its limits. It's important to remember these are retrospective, meaning people were looking back at what happened. This can sometimes affect memories. Also, the sample was mostly young women and fluent in German. So we have to be careful about generalizing these findings to everyone. They also focused on just the most distressing event, not the full trauma history of all participants. And while they did a mediation analysis, which is a powerful statistical tool, it's important to note that because the data was collected at one point in time, we can't definitively say that one thing caused the other. It shows a strong association, but longitudinal studies where you follow people over time would be needed to confirm cause and effect. So, to wrap it up, this research gives us a really valuable insight. The type of trauma matters, but how you cope afterwards might be just as if not more important, especially when it comes to avoidance strategies. For anyone who has gone through a tough time, particularly something from another person, really thinking about your coping mechanisms and perhaps seeking support to shift towards more adaptive strategies could be a game changer for your well-being. I love that this study doesn't just point out problems, but also hints at solutions within therapy. It reinforces the idea that our internal responses to external events are incredibly powerful. What do you think about these findings? Have you noticed how your own coping styles affect your stress levels? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.